Welcome to the Wade Center's podcast.
A podcast of Wheaton College.
Welcome to the Wade Center podcast. We are delighted today to be joined by Diana Glyer, who we have interviewed before about her earlier work. She just established this amazing precedent with her book about the collaboration among the Inklings. And now we are talking to her in order to welcome her new book called The Major and the Missionary. David, first, why don't you recap what her earlier book was about?
Well, The Company They Keep was a landmark book because there's been an assumption for probably 50 years that the Inklings did not influence each other. They encouraged each other, but they didn't actually. And they themselves said that. Their biographers said that. So that was kind of an established fact. And Diana came along and exploded that idea, and she proved how much they did influence each other. And she talked about all the different ways in which a writer's circle can encourage and influence and improve each other's works. Then she came back with a more popular version, Bandersnatch, which is not only about the Inklings, but it's also for the reader, saying, here's how you can emulate some of their success in writers' groups, and here's how you can help each other. So that, I think, probably one of the most important books about the Inklings in the 21st century. If I had to pick out one per decade, I think that would be the one for the first decade of the 21st century. So thank you for that, Diana.
Thank you. Thank you for those kind words.
And now we have another project. Diana, why don't you tell us what ignited this project and describe who is the major and who is the missionary?
So the major and the missionary started, I guess I would say, accidentally or providentially, because I was in the Wade Center more than 20 years ago, and I was trying to gather all of the primary data that went into writing my book, The Company They Keep. So as David said, this is a very controversial thesis that the Inklings actually had influence on each other. In fact, I have had so many experiences of getting literally booed when I talked about it. I had a person tell me that the Inklings were geniuses and they didn't need any help.
Wow.
And that I was somehow diminishing the sense of their accomplishments by suggesting that they supported one another in all of these various ways. Fortunately, that's not the prevailing view anymore. And I'm really grateful for that because I do believe we have a lot to learn from the wonderful ways that the Inklings supported one another, challenged one another, and brought out the best in each other. So I was in the Wade Center doing research specifically to try to find out more firsthand accounts of what happened in Inklings meetings. So I believe that sometimes in academic circles, academics tend to sort of argue with one another about interpretations. And I think the way we get out of that rut, that circular argument, I think this, no, I think it means that, is we go back to the primary documents and we ask ourselves afresh, what did they say at the time? How did they characterize some of these different interactions? And what details can we re-understand, reinterpret, bring to the surface that we maybe hadn't taken account of before? So I had the delight of spending several weeks at the Wade and was going through box after box of letters and diary entries and other documents by Warren Hamilton Lewis, so C.S. Lewis's brother. Warren Lewis, there's a lot to say about him, but he was an excellent historian. And that meant that he had a particular gift for paying attention to current details, as well as reflecting meaningfully on the past. So I'm going through boxes of letters by Warren Lewis, and all of a sudden I run into this letter, not from Warren Lewis, but to Warren Lewis. And I thought, forgive me, but I thought at first someone had like filed something. I couldn't figure out, like, why is this letter from this woman, Blanche Biggs, in this box of materials from Warren Lewis? So I look at the letter, and here is what this letter says, this very first letter that I saw. It's dated October 5th, 1968, and here's an excerpt. It says, "Dear Major Lewis, I hope that you have the patience in answering letters from strangers that your brother had. This letter is written from curiosity, but there's a purpose behind it. I have just finished reading the C.S. Lewis letters edited by you. I bought his letters because so many of his books have been a help to me. I think that C.S. Lewis's chief gift was clearing away starry-eyed sentiment and anchoring our faith soundly in truth. And now to my question, how did all those letters survive? I find that I am in a similar situation. I confess that I am a hoarder. I keep all my letters, feeling that they may be needed someday. Some of my letters might be useful in the future, perhaps even after my death. I have been a missionary doctor living here in Papua for some 20 years. I've seen this territory developing right under my nose. It's a grand story, one that deserves to be told. So now I am asking myself, should I just have a great big bonfire and burn the lot of them?
Wow.
So that's Blanche's letter, and I thought, that's really cool. And I was just intrigued. I was intrigued by her passion and her feistiness. I was intrigued by why this one random letter would be in this box. So then I turn the page, and I find out that Warren has answered the letter. Now, I have to tell you how exciting this was for me, because I've been studying primary documents, diary entries, and letters for decades. And the idea that you would have a letter and a response together.
Yes.
Right? I mean, think how often we read the collected letters of C.S. Lewis and we're thinking, oh, Lord, if only I knew what question he was answering. Or if only I had the larger context so that I could make sense of why he says that in that way. You know, there's all those things that, boy, that's a little odd, the way he kind of goes about some topic or some issue. But we don't have both sides of the correspondence. And that's true not only in Lewis studies, but anytime we're looking at ancient documents and ancient letters. So I thought, I can't believe it. 2 letters in a row, right? And then another one, and then another one. There are 87 letters altogether, including a couple of postcards and other kinds of correspondence, references to gifts that the 2 of them exchanged with one another. And it starts out with this fascinating sort of question that I think is so pertinent to what you do at the Wade Center, which is, what is the value of letters? What is the value of these ancient documents? What's the point in saving this stuff and making it available to the larger community? And to me, there's a lot of great things that I think the Major and the Missionary underscores, but maybe one of the most important, as you can see from this very, very first letter, is the value of preserving these materials and making them available. So we don't just talk about the people in the past. We actually hear them speak in their own words, giving their own account of their life and life's experiences. And I love what you guys do. And I love the opportunity to really dig into a letters collection like this. It's really an extraordinary privilege.
And I'm sure that when she admits to being a hoarder, that struck a sympathetic note with Warren, because he also was famously a hoarder.
Yeah.
So they got off to a good start.
And there's a bit of hoarding at the Wade, too.
Right.
You know, in fact, when people ask me, what do you think is the best thing that Dorothy Sayers ever wrote, since I'm a Sayers scholar, and I say her collected letters.
Yes.
And it makes me so sad that today's generations, because of email and texting, I mean, people even aren't emailing anymore. They're texting. They don't even worry about nuance. And this valuable resource for learning exactly what someone thought, which when you write a letter, you're going to add more explanation. It is being lost. So great writers in our own time, how are we going to preserve their thought processes outside of their publication?
I would say have a congressional hearing. That's how you uncover most correspondence.
So all that to say, Diana, we love what you have done. So tell us some of the things that struck you as you were reading these letters back and forth between this missionary and Warren, who was a major in the Army.
There's so many things that really did stand out. I love your emphasis on the issue of letters and that this is a lost art, right?
Yes.
So when I'm talking to my students, at Azusa Pacific about letter collections. They have no frame of reference for a letter. When I tell them that the letters between Warnie and Blanche often would take 6 to 8 weeks to arrive, they have no idea. They can't fathom that a deep friendship, indeed a kind of intimacy, could develop through letters over such a great distance and such great blocks of time. But as you say, Crystal, a lot of times the best writing we have from these authors are the letters, because unlike an email, which is a business sort of transaction, or a text, which is a quick information method, a letter it's like a little essay. It's developed, it's thoughtful, it elaborates what's happening in such a beautiful and deliberate way. And so part of it is just reimagining and rediscovering the beauty of letters. Sometimes people will ask me, David, as I'm sure they ask you sometimes, if you could take only one C.S. Lewis book to a desert island, which one would it be? And I always say the collected letters.
Right. I would have a very similar answer. They asked G.K. Chesterton, if you could only take one book to a desert island, what would it be? And he said it would be A Practical Guide to Shipbuilding.
That's probably the best answer. That's probably the best answer of all. So I had the privilege of talking to the Oxford C.S. Lewis Society years ago about this letter collection, and Walter Hooper was there. And so I got a chance to talk with him. Not only
explain who Walter Hooper is to some of our listeners.
Yes, Walter Hooper was C.S. Lewis's secretary in the last years of his life. And then Walter devoted the rest of his life to doing all that he could to care for C.S. Lewis's legacy, making sure that books stayed in print, making sure that people heard about the works of C.S. Lewis. And so just as Christopher Tolkien was responsible for maintaining and preserving his father's legacy throughout his books, the Tolkien books, I think that Walter did that for C.S. Lewis, and that so much of the success that those books enjoyed happened because of the energy, the vision that Walter devoted to making sure that those works would not be lost, and that C.S. Lewis's writing stayed in the conversation. So that people could discover them. So Walter Hooper and I talked for quite a bit about these letters between the Major and the Missionary. And as I shared excerpts, one of the things that Walter said was that he believed these letters have the power to rehabilitate our understanding of the Major. Those are his exact words. So why would Warren Lewis's legacy or reputation or nature need rehabilitating? And how do these letters do that? I think a lot of times, for understandable reasons, Warren Lewis is truncated. Our view of him, it shrinks. He is C.S. Lewis's brother. He's an Army major, and he had struggles throughout his life. And we only see him sort of in that sort of short summary, and we don't get the fullness of his nature. So you asked me what I discovered. I think one of the big discoveries is that in a lot of the biographies that mention Warren Lewis by people who knew him, he's described as somebody who is warm and gregarious. And yet that's not the personality that we think of when we think of Warren Lewis, right? You may remember one of the children who lived at the kilns during wartime, Jill Freud, when she was trying to characterize what Warnie was like, she said, he was comfy to be with all the time. And again, that's not usually the picture that we have of him. Douglas Gresham recalls how when Warren Lewis was out about town, he was saying hello to everybody and calling them by name. So when you think about the Inklings, you don't think of them being a particularly gregarious or outgoing group, right? They tend to be more reserved academics. But Warren Lewis was sociable, warm, and open-hearted. This view of him, I think, has been obscured. And I think that these letters go a long way to rehabilitating our sense of his true character. Another insight worth mentioning is through these letters, we also learn a lot about his spiritual practice. So we don't think about that particularly very much, but Warren Lewis writes to Blanche about his spirituality during his retirement. So here's what he says. a letter in August 1969. He says, "One great thing about retirement is you do have the time for prayer, but alas, not always the inclination. But one must stick doggedly to a routine and pray for inclination. My practice is to get up at 6 a.m. I make a cup of tea, and then I pray while the whole world around me is quiet. I've long ago given up the almost universal habit of saying my prayers last thing at night. That's about the worst hour one could choose, I think."
Mm.
The thing that surprises me most about that is that a retired person would get up at 6 in the morning.
That wouldn't be your choice, would it, David?
Right. But Blanche wrote back and said she also got up at 6 in the morning. So even though they were probably, 12 or 15 time zones apart, it's interesting that they both chose the first thing in the morning for their prayers.
Yes, I love that. And I also love the tiny detail and how much they both rejoice in that closeness that they feel, even though their 6 a.m.s are quite different. There is a camaraderie that's established by the idea that they both have this pattern of regular prayer.
Yeah, that's great. I was interested in the letters. Lewis is so famous for being a mere Christian. In fact, he says, I gave the manuscript to these to a Catholic, a Methodist, an Anglican, and a Baptist. And I was surprised in the letters that didn't rub off more on Warren. Warren had very strong opinions about Catholics and even Methodists.
Well, one of the great things about these letters is we see arguments in real time.
Right.
Yes.
So they're not like, this is not the end result of this debate. These two very strong, very opinionated, mature Christians spend a lot of time fighting about various topics, and boy, can Blanche hold her own. So one of the big topics that they end up discussing is this whole idea of the ecumenical approach to faith, or mere Christian approach. And it's really interesting to me that from the start, Blanche, as a missionary serving in Papua New Guinea, trying to get some foothold on that tiny nation for the Anglican mission, works really hard to host conferences and special events for individuals from every Christian denomination that she can. And that makes sense on the mission field. There's a lot of work and not very many hands to help carry, right? And so that is one of her main focuses throughout her time as a missionary in Papua New Guinea. Warren isn't very open to that. He's pretty frustrated with that. And it circles back for him to another current debate that his church is facing. So at the time the letters open, the Anglican Church and the Methodist Church are in discussion about the possibility of joining together. And he's really grumpy about this idea. He says, well, if we're right, they should just come over to our side. And if they're right, we should just go over to their side, and none of this like mushy middle, right?
Right.
And Blanche persistently and tenderly keeps on bringing him back to this idea that maybe it's a good witness to the world for us to treat one another well. And maybe while we have differences in emphasis, if we take the time to get to know one another really well at the core, we'll find that the basics, right, have a lot more in common than they do differences. And, and he doesn't buy this. And in the first sets of letters, he has unkind things to say about these impulses toward a mere Christianity. But here's my favorite part of the whole letter series. I'm going to give away the whole book right here. There is an event that I call the miracle at the heart of the Major and the Missionary. And so Blanche and Warnie are arguing and debating and given their best arguments for these two very, very different views. And then there is one letter where everything shifts for Warnie. And here's what happens. He is in the hospital. He's developed gangrene in his feet. And while he's there, because gangrene takes some time, he's there for some time. And because he's gregarious, he gets to know a lot of the nurses personally. And they end up getting together for social times in the nurses' station, right? Because he's there for a long time. He gets to know them. one particular night, he's there for a social hour with the nurses, and he realizes that sitting around in the station are representatives of just about every different point of view that are part of the Catholic Protestant debate in Northern Ireland. Now, you know that
Wow.
Jack and Warnie grew up in Northern Ireland. The Troubles are in just full effect during the course of these letters. There are bombings, there are shootings, there are tragedies happening all the time. And so this is also a topic that Blanche and Warnie talk about. But Warren, with these nurses, people he's gotten to know, sitting around the table, all of a sudden, even though he's in his 70s, Warren has an epiphany. He really does. And he writes to Blanche and he says, I had the most extraordinary experience. I sat around talking to these representatives of Catholic and Protestant, different political views. And he says, and we got along like a house on fire. And then he concludes, if there was only a little bit more face-to-face connection, a little bit more getting together person to person, how different this world would be. And you can hear in this letter, I love this letter so much, you can hear the sort of awe and wonder. This is a genuine transformation moment for Warren. He gets it, that we can argue about policies and politics and theological differences, but the secret to actually making forward motion is sitting down and getting to know one another and recognizing one another as people face to face. And he says, and discovering they're not fire-breathing dragons.
Yes. And that's what strikes me about why people should buy this book of yours. Because Blanche is such a strong woman. She doesn't demur because, oh, here's a man who's the brother of C.S. Lewis and was a major in the army. She sticks to her guns. She is just amazing. And
as Diana says in the intro, Blanche was no fawning fangirl.
Yeah, great phrase. Great phrase.
That, Diana.
But to make us realize that these women who went out as missionaries in the 1940s is when she must have gone out, if she was still writing him in the late 60s, they're going to be the strong, intelligent persons who have thought through their faith, have the fortitude to be on their own. They aren't just accompanying and being the helper-server. They are there to communicate the word of Christ. And so I loved learning about this woman who, if it hadn't have been for you, Diana, the world would not have the opportunity to know of her strength and passion for the Lord that was fed by C.S. Lewis, Warnie's brother. So I just thank you so much for this. And it makes me wonder, are all the letters that you published in this volume, were they found in the Wade, or did you find some other letters beyond the Wade holdings that you included?
Yeah, good question. I love the emphasis on Blanche because I started this because I'm an inkling scholar. That's what I do. But the more I work with these letters, the more I was enchanted by Blanche Biggs. There she is on the mission field. She's working primarily with leprosy and tuberculosis patients, which are big deals, but she's on the mission field. So she is also delivering babies. And she's also performing surgeries. One of the very first things that happens in her first year in Papua New Guinea is that she encounters a patient whose arm has been chewed to bits by an alligator, and she has to do surgery to put it back together. This is not in her kind of expertise, but she's there. And so she does what she can. In addition to all of that, she's the chief administrator of the hospital and the surrounding organizational structures of the Anglican mission there in Papua New Guinea. So she is a remarkable person. The letters, as they're published in the book, are all of the letters that are currently at the Wade. So partly, I think, because of this correspondence that Blanche had with Warney, she kept her letters, she kept his letters, she kept carbons of her letters, which is why we have both of them. And she donated them to the Wade, and that's how they happened to be there. And I think that that's a marvelous gift. So anybody who's got letters, if you got important books, if you have important documents that help us to have this firsthand window into the past, please send them to the Wade.
Right.
But to answer your question, once I found the letters, decided I wanted to work with them, I wanted to reach out and find out if there was anyone who knew her that was still alive.
Yes.
And if I could have their permission to pursue this project to begin with. So I reached out to two particular individuals. First was the archivist at the Friar Library, which is a special collection at the University of Queensland in Australia. They have Blanche's diaries and photograph collections. So those are there. And then I reached out to her godson. His name is John Biggs. And he gave me permission, sent me a lot of photographs to work with, and answered a lot of questions. John Biggs is an author also. And so he had some interesting things to say about family history. And I worked with him. That didn't add to the letter collection, but it did add to the annotations.
And he gave you that introduction, which was interesting to get his personal reflection. She was his aunt and his godmother. Is that what he said in his foreword?
That's correct. So the book has a foreword by John talking about his aunt, an introduction by me, which tries to explain what I think is significant here, why I think we should pay attention, and then an afterword that kind of includes the rest of the story after the letters end.
Yeah. What
Wonderful.
surprised you as you actually got through the whole stack of letters? What insights emerged that you maybe were not expecting?
I think the biggest surprise for me was how compelling their story is. So when I'm talking to people about it, this is one of the hardest things for me to try to convey, is how moving this friendship is. So Blanche writes basically a fan letter of appreciation for the editing work that Warren Lewis has done in writing and editing the letters of C.S. Lewis. He writes back with enthusiasm. Don't burn your letters. You're obviously the kind of person who could write a book. Have a go at writing a book yourself. And then she writes back, well, maybe I will, and you should not stop writing either. So they start out with this sort of playful encouragement at the beginning. About a third of the way through the letter collection, there's an emergency at the hospital. There's a scandal. And if you think about it, Blanche doesn't really have anybody that she can confide in. She's the chief administrator in an undeveloped territory. She can't talk to any of her staff about how hard this is for her. She's struggling with this event. On the other side of it, Warren Lewis is trying to somehow figure out what it means. Now that C.S. Lewis has died, he's trying to figure out, what does it mean for me to keep my brother's legacy alive? I keep getting letters for him. I keep getting visitors at the kilns. And I feel like I'm somehow the caretaker, but I don't know what that role looks like. And he's trying to figure it out. And he doesn't have anybody to confide in either. So at the point when there is this scandal at the hospital, Blanche pours out her heart to Warney. And at first he doesn't respond very wisely. He's a little dense. But through the course of a couple of letters, he finally gets it. And there's a shift. And he says, you can please feel free to confide in me anytime that you might wish to. He begins to confide more. She begins to confide in him. And there's a deepening. They go from being pen pals to being confidants. As the letters progress, Blanche begins to, I don't know how else to put it. She flirts a little bit. She changes the way that she addresses him. She signs her letters with affectionately or affectionately yours. And they begin to plan a visit to see one another, to actually meet for the first time. So it was surprising to me to see how clearly this friendship goes from being mere information, interesting kinds of storytelling, interesting insights into various activities, to confiding deeply in one another, listening sincerely to one another's hearts, and then establishing something that really is a kind of love between them. And I think that story in and of itself is pretty remarkable.
And didn't she visit his grave after he passed away? She wanted to make that personal visit a little later than they'd hoped that would happen.
Yes, she does. She does visit the kilns and the church and his grave. And for her as a missionary, on just a pittance of an allowance, that was it was a big trip. It was a daring trip. It was an expensive trip. And it's a testimony, I think, to her affection for him.
And it is appropriate for C.S. Lewis studies because a lot of people don't realize how Lewis himself was attracted to very strong women and women who stood up to him, like Dorothy Sayers, who I think prepared him for Joy Davidman, whom he married. And Joy, she would just confront Lewis all the time, but he loved that. And Warney, the very fact he kept up this correspondence, I think he may have shared that with his brother. Their mother, of course, must have been an amazing woman in the late 19th century to get a degree in mathematics, when an advanced degree in mathematics, when not many women were even going to college. So I think your book helps us understand and appreciate Lewis as well, but also introduces us to an amazing woman. And we will have your book for sale at the Wade Center. We will be ordering it, and I encourage our listeners to write to the Wade if you want to buy a copy. Do you have any last comments that you would like to make about this whole process of discovery and then conceptualization and now making it available to others?
I'm so grateful for your observation about the strength of Blanche and the importance that she takes to this correspondence. One of the challenges for me is trying to figure out how I can help people who are part of the missionary community discover this letter. So yes, it's of keen interest, I think, to anyone who's at all interested in Inkling studies. But how to get this book in the hands of those who have a passion for missions, world missions, and who are interested in reading these firsthand accounts of what life is like on the mission field in the 1960s and the 1970s. So I'm interested in thoughts about that, of course. But I think ultimately it circles back to what we talked about at the very beginning of our conversation, and that's the value of letters, the value of firsthand research, the wonder of being able to hear from these people in their own words. You know, it's interesting that you mentioned Joy Davidman and his relationship with C.S. Lewis, because, of course, that started through letters.
Oh, that's right.
Right.
And
Good
their friendship and marriage started because Joy sent Jack a letter, and they became pen friends and correspondents and then confidants through their letters with a focus on theological issues and questions. You know, this is wild speculation on my part, but I wonder, as the friendship between Blanche and Warney deepened, I wonder if there wasn't some part of him that thought back to Joy Davidman, who he adored, and the love relationship, late in life romance that had blossomed between Jack and Joy, how precious that was and how happy he was for his brother's happiness. And I wonder, pure speculation, I wonder if there wasn't a little fleeting notion that perhaps this would be his chance, his time,
His joy,
his
in both senses.
His joy.
So listeners, as you read these letters and look at the development of this relationship, I think that's an area to really think about, ponder. What are the parallels that are here between the relationship between Blanche and Warney and Joy and Jack, And how can we bring those into clearer focus? And is there evidence that perhaps this was in his thoughts, ever so fleeting glimmer of hope, that perhaps he had found his joy? Yeah.
Oh, thank you so much for joining us, Diana. It's always great to talk to you. David and I have had the privilege of speaking at conferences where you are, and Diana is a fantastic speaker. She always gets standing ovations. So this is a special treat.
Thanks for joining us, Diana.
Thank you so much. It's really, really good to spend time with you.
The Wade Center podcast is a production of the Marion E. Wade Center at Wheaton College in Wheaton, Illinois. Our hosts are the co-directors of the Wade Center, Drs. Crystal and David C. Downing. Our episodes are produced and edited by Aaron M. Hill. If you enjoy the podcast and the content we offer, please leave us a review on iTunes, tell your friends, and consider making a donation to the Wade. The Wade Center is entirely self-funded. Financial gifts help support the expert services, vast collections, and varied programming we offer at no cost. If you have questions about the podcast or suggestions for future episodes, please email us at wade@wheaton.edu or contact us via Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. To learn more about the Wade Center, our 7 British Christian authors, what we offer, and how to make a donation, visit our website at wheaton.edu/Wade.